Some voices do not seek to communicate, they demand attention, filling the space with noise that drowns everything else. Quietly and relentlessly, you feel a strange tension building inside, a subtle irritation that you cannot fully name, yet it lingers long after the sound fades. It is not just the volume. It is the certainty with which opinions are spoken, the arrogance that mistakes are invisible to them. You start questioning whether your silence is weakness, patience, or something else entirely, because their words feel like an assault on your presence. You tell yourself you can respond logically, clearly, politely, but the louder they get, the smaller your own voice feels inside, and the more you consider speaking, the more you realize silence is a choice that comes with its own unseen consequences. Why does your mind feel trapped even when your lips are still? And why do they seem to expand the room without effort? And what if the real struggle is not about them at all, but about what happens inside you when they are present? Imagine a person at a family dinner who dominates every conversation, asserting opinions loudly while others nod quietly, believing the discussion is fair. Picture someone in a meeting who repeats points over and over, convinced clarity is being delivered rather than realizing energy is being drained from the room. Imagine standing next to a person who dismisses others mid-sentence, smiling as if balance has been achieved, thinking their voice organizes the chaos around them. They feel in control because their words fill the space, the air bends around them, and interruptions are ignored effortlessly. They believe that people listen and follow their rhythm because of respect or logic, not realizing obedience is often a quiet escape from confrontation. The louder and more certain they are, the more secure they feel, thinking influence equals understanding, when it is merely temporary dominance. Each sentence reinforces their perception of authority, while anyone quieter begins to adapt subconsciously, filtering words, shrinking gestures, and pacing thoughts carefully from their perspective. Silence is a sign of agreement, attentiveness, or weakness, never an expression of personal choice or internal resistance. They never consider the quiet tension building around them, because their focus is on maintaining the appearance of control at all times. And yet, what feels like mastery is fragile, dependent entirely on others conforming unconsciously. And this is where the illusion begins to crack. The control is not real. It is a psychological mirage created by volume, certainty, and the assumption that everyone else must adjust. And this is the first hint that your response may not be about them at all, but about your own internal landscape. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Imagine a person standing silently at a crowded party, listening as someone loudly declares opinions that feel exaggerated, absurd, and impossible to engage with meaningfully. They notice how their own responses shrink, words retreating into the mind while the louder voice dominates, leaving no room for subtlety or nuance. This is the first crack, because the noise is not just external, it triggers a deep internal reaction. A tension you cannot simply ignore. The unsettling truth begins to surface quietly. Your silence is being shaped by more than politeness or self-control. It is a survival mechanism. Every shouted opinion and repeated claim amplifies an instinct to preserve energy, reduce conflict, and avoid being emotionally drained unnecessarily. The louder the other becomes, the more the brain seeks mental shelter, building internal walls rather than outwardly challenging the noise. This instinct is not weakness. It is an ancient mechanism designed to maintain equilibrium. When confrontation seems futile or dangerous, you begin noticing how often this pattern repeats with people who are confident, reckless, or unaware of the impact of their volume. Your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting the energy and certainty of the louder person, while your own internal state shifts subtly, without notice. And this is when you realize your quiet is not absence. It is active negotiation happening within your own nervous system. The first crack shows that staying silent is not passivity, but a psychological response, and it quietly reshapes how interactions unfold. And once this realization appears, you begin to see why the louder person's certainty affects you more than their logic or reasoning. Picture someone who grew up in environments where loud voices demanded attention, where speaking out meant risk, correction, or social discomfort waiting patiently. Imagine a child learning that silence preserved safety, reduced punishment, and allowed observation of others' behavior before risking engagement or emotional exposure. Over time, the brain encodes this pattern, associating loud certainty with potential conflict and silence with survival, creating neural pathways that operate automatically. This conditioning does not feel conscious. It manifests as an instinctive tendency to withdraw or modulate voice around people who dominate space. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The brain rewards silence because it once protected emotional and physical safety, turning quiet observation into a deeply ingrained response. Without active awareness, the louder person triggers this pattern, and your nervous system responds before your mind has a chance to decide rationally. You notice a tightening of attention, a sharpening of perception, and subtle calculation of when to speak or remain invisible. This internal process is often mistaken for disinterest, weakness, or passivity by others, but it is an adaptive cognitive strategy learned over time. Repeated exposure to such dynamics reinforces the pathways, making silence the automatic default. When confronted with dominant or reckless voices, the louder person believes their influence is external, but it is your brain's learned response that gives them temporary psychological control. And this is why staying silent can feel effortless in some moments and impossibly difficult in others. Depending on history and context, the brain finds emotional benefit in quiet, preserving energy, avoiding unnecessary conflict, and maintaining mental equilibrium when external noise becomes overwhelming. And this reveals why silence is not absence. It is a form of subtle psychological negotiation, deeply rooted in past conditioning. Remaining silent around loud, ignorant people carries a hidden payoff that is invisible until you notice the subtle shift it creates inside you. Each moment of restraint gives your brain a sense of control, as if containing your response preserves mental energy and protects against unnecessary stress. You feel a quiet satisfaction in maintaining composure, a mental relief that the interaction did not escalate into conflict or emotional chaos. This payoff is private, internal, and entirely unobserved by the louder person who believes dominance equals influence, unaware that silence can be far more powerful. The act of holding back becomes a subtle assertion, a way to maintain dignity without needing validation or agreement from anyone present. You begin to recognize that silence allows observation, reflection, and understanding, turning the overwhelming noise into data that your mind processes carefully. Each restrained moment becomes a silent negotiation, asserting boundaries without confrontation, reducing unnecessary tension while preserving your mental clarity. Over time, this pattern becomes reinforcing, because you notice how much more composed and centered you feel compared to the chaos around you. The hidden payoff is not recognition or applause. It is the calm, internal authority that comes from mastering your reaction and energy. It is a private form of power, invisible to the louder person, yet profoundly shaping how interactions unfold and how you experience them. And this quiet benefit explains why you may unconsciously gravitate towards silence. Even when the impulse to speak feels strong and natural, the louder person interprets your silence as submission, agreement, or indifference. But in reality, it is a subtle strategy protecting your mental space. And once you feel this payoff, you begin to understand that silence is not weakness. It is a form of self-preservation deeply embedded in psychology. This leads into the deeper layer, where silence becomes entwined with identity, shaping how you see yourself around overwhelming voices. Imagine a person who begins to identify themselves as the quiet one in groups, believing their value lies in restraint, observation, and strategic silence. Picture them noticing that speaking less reduces conflict, earns subtle respect, and preserves energy, slowly merging silence with a sense of personal identity. Over time, remaining silent is no longer a choice but a defining trait, a mental script reinforced by repeated interactions with loud, dominating people. Their quiet becomes a marker of self-image, a protective identity that reassures them that they are thoughtful, composed, and in control internally. If you've noticed this in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. This identity traps them because speaking up feels like violating their own learned script, creating anxiety even when the situation no longer demands restraint. They begin interpreting the world through this lens, seeing loudness as dangerous, recklessness as threatening, and volume as a cue to disappear. Mentally, the quiet identity shapes their relationships, guiding how they interact, the boundaries they maintain, and the energy they invest in conversations. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop, where silence feels safe, predictable, and integral to who they are as a person, and the more it solidifies, the more challenging it becomes to discern whether silence is choice, strategy, or unconscious habit. This identity provides protection, but it also narrows perception, limiting awareness of the dynamics unfolding around them without confrontation. And this is where a shift in perspective becomes possible, revealing silence as not just defense, but as a lens through which the world is interpreted, which leads into the moment when everything you thought about control, noise, and reaction begins to look different, quietly shifting your understanding. What if the loud, ignorant voices are not your problem, but a mirror showing how your mind responds to chaos, uncertainty, and overstimulation? What if silence is not passivity, but an active form of perception, a way of preserving clarity while the world around you rages with noise? Seen this way, the situation becomes less about controlling others and more about understanding the internal mechanisms triggered by their volume and certainty. The loud person is not an enemy. They are a stimulus, a catalyst that reveals patterns in your nervous system that you rarely observe consciously. Your silence is not absence. It is intentional space, a buffer that allows observation, reflection, and mental organization without demanding external validation. And the discomfort you feel is not a flaw. It is information, a signal highlighting where your energy is being drawn and how it is being managed. You begin noticing that listening without immediate response changes the dynamic, not by confrontation, but by quietly shifting the energy in the interaction. The reframing transforms the act of staying silent into a perspective, a psychological tool for understanding behavior rather than resisting it. You start seeing their certainty as a projection of their internal anxiety, a coping mechanism rather than an attack on you or your intelligence. This perspective softens irritation and frustration, replacing them with curiosity, subtle awareness, and the ability to navigate interactions without losing mental stability. And once this lens is applied, the loudness no longer demands reaction. It becomes a phenomenon to be observed, decoded, and understood quietly. Your silence becomes a conscious choice, not a habit, and the tension in your body begins to release with this understanding. And with this shift, you realize that mastery of silence is mastery of perception, not control over the external chaos, which prepares you for the next stage, where calm, reflective awareness transforms these insights into lived experience. After adopting this perspective, you notice your body responds differently when someone dominates conversation, tension softening before it had a chance to rise. You become aware of the subtle pull to respond, interrupt, or assert yourself, and how intentionally holding back changes your internal state immediately. Your breathing, posture, and attention align with quiet observation, turning previously tense moments into spaces for reflection and understanding. You feel a small expansion in mental space, a distance between the noise outside and the stability inside, allowing thought to remain clear. The shift is not forced. It is a gentle recalibration of attention, perception, and energy in response to overwhelming input from others. You notice patterns repeating in conversations previously unnoticed, revealing motives, anxiety, and behavioral scripts that exist beyond the words being spoken. This awareness creates subtle freedom, because you are no longer compelled to respond emotionally or mentally to every intrusion. You see the loudness as temporary, external, and largely irrelevant to your inner balance, even as others remain unaware of your quiet strength. And the quiet shift is cumulative, each interaction reinforcing the ability to maintain composure, observe without reaction, and preserve mental clarity, which leads into a final mirror where reflection reveals more than just interactions, but the underlying patterns shaping your responses. You begin noticing how often your mind reacts before your body or voice can respond, rehearsing arguments and corrections that never need to be spoken. You realize that the loud, ignorant voices are amplifying patterns already present inside you, making visible the ways your mind seeks balance and safety. Reflection reveals that silence is more than restraint. It is a lens into how perception, past conditioning, and energy management intersect. In real time. You see that irritation, frustration, and the impulse to respond are not caused by others, but by your own internal narratives about control and respect. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to study these patterns, noticing triggers, energy shifts, and the subtle tug between instinct and choice. You recognize the paradox that the quieter you remain, the more internally powerful you feel, even as external chaos increases around you. This mirror shows that people rarely change, but your awareness of patterns, triggers, and responses changes how every conversation shapes your internal state. You begin to understand that mastery of silence is not about influencing others. It is about self-observation, presence, and preservation of mental equilibrium. And in this reflection, the loudness of others loses its ability to disturb, leaving only insight, awareness, and a sense of quiet authority, because the final mirror does not judge, it only reveals, allowing you to see the underlying structures of interaction without needing to act. Next time you find yourself surrounded by loud, reckless voices, you may notice more than their words. Recognizing the patterns that trigger your internal responses, you may sense the invisible negotiation happening in your nervous system, balancing energy, attention, and emotional stability against the intrusion of external chaos. Your silence will no longer feel passive or powerless. It will feel like an active engagement with reality that does not require visible action. You may discover that remaining quiet allows observation, understanding, and reflection in ways speaking cannot, providing a subtle authority invisible to everyone else. And you may notice how quickly the internal tension subsides when you accept that control over others is an illusion and observation is power, because understanding behavior does not require participation. It only requires presence, attention, and awareness of the hidden forces shaping interactions. This awareness quietly transforms the way you experience everyday life, turning noise into information, irritation into insight, and chaos into psychological data. And once you begin seeing these patterns, the world of loud, ignorant voices becomes a space for reflection, not reaction, a place to study rather than fight. So the question is not how to respond to their noise, but what your silence is revealing about your own mind. And the final thought lingers softly. What if every moment of quiet is not absence, but the beginning of something profoundly visible inside?